Welcome to the grand finale of Season 2 of our Explainer. We've spent this entire season unpacking history together, right? But today, we are setting the stage for something truly monumental. Today, we confront the ultimate David and Goliath scenarios of the 20th century. We're looking at two distinct historical miracles, the Chaco War and the Winter War, where vastly smaller nations literally bent great powers to their will. This is a comparative historical analysis of asymmetric warfare at its absolute maximum scale. Let's get right into it.
To do this justice, we're going to break things down into four rigorous parts: the essence of both fronts, resources and terrain, outcomes and legacy, the universal principle at play, and finally, our verdict. Let's start with Section 1, two fronts, one essence. It is 1932. The Chaco War begins. Bolivia attacks with 70,000 men, backed by heavy artillery and German military advisors. On paper, the numbers dictate an overwhelming victory for the invader. But Paraguay responds. Under the command of General José Félix Estigarribia, the defending army relies on an intimate, relentless knowledge of a deeply lethal terrain. They accept a harsh truth. A long, grueling war of attrition destroys Bolivia much more than it destroys Paraguay. 3 years pass in the brutal heat, and Paraguay achieves victory.
Now, notice the perfect parallel between these two commanders. We have Estigarribia in Paraguay and Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim in Finland. Geographically, culturally, these two are worlds apart, yet both face mathematically impossible odds. And crucially, both meet those odds with the exact same strategic clarity. Let's move to the second front and see exactly how this builds. It is 1939. The Winter War begins. The USSR attacks with 500,000 soldiers and thousands of tanks. On paper, the numbers dictate an overwhelming victory for the invader. But Finland responds. Under the command of Mannerheim, the defending army uses the freezing winter and dense forests as an impenetrable wall. 105 days pass in the brutal cold. More than 120,000 Soviet soldiers fall. Finland cedes a fraction of its territory, but it successfully preserves its independence. Moving to Section 2, Resources and Terrain. Criteria 1 and 2. The symmetry between these two narratives is just striking, isn't it? But to truly understand how these miracles actually happened, we need to shift from cinematic storytelling into rigorous military history. Criterion 1 is resource asymmetry. And the sheer scale of the disadvantage here is staggering. In the Chaco, Paraguay faced an enemy that was materially superior in weapons, aircraft, funding, pretty much everything. But in Finland, the material disadvantage was astronomically worse. The USSR didn't just have more men, they had thousands of tanks against a Finnish army that practically had none. Both of these small nations faced material impossibility, but mathematically, Finland faced a Goliath of global proportions. So how do you even begin to bridge that massive gap? Well, that brings us to Criterion 2, terrain as a weapon. You see, you don't just fight in the environment, you fight with it. In the Chaco, Paraguay weaponized extreme heat and deadly thirst. They drew Bolivian supply lines deep into an arid hellscape that the invaders simply didn't understand. Over in Finland, Mannerheim weaponized the freezing winter and dense pine forests, trapping heavy Soviet mechanized units on narrow, snow-covered roads where they were systematically dismantled. Both defenders turned their lethal geography into an active, aggressive weapon against an enemy who was totally blind to where they were standing. That takes us to Section 3, Outcomes and Legacy, Criteria 3 and 4. So, we know that the terrain neutralized the numbers, but what did that actually achieve in the end? Let's look at Criterion 3, Strategic Outcome. We are looking strictly at the results here. Paraguay won an absolute territorial victory. They completely secured the entire Chaco region they set out to defend, and they maintained their independence. Finland, on the other hand, fought a bitter, brutal defense. They maintained their independence, yes, but they were forced to cede 11% of their territory to the Soviets. So if we look rigidly at who achieved their absolute stated goals, Paraguay's victory is strategically more complete. They won everything they aimed for. But then, Criterion 4 completely shifts the weight: historical legacy. Now, the Chaco War fundamentally reshaped South American borders, and it became a standard, highly respected model in Latin American military academies for logistics and asymmetric tactics. But the Winter War? The Winter War literally changed the globe. Finland's fierce resistance fundamentally altered Joseph Stalin's perception of his own military's readiness, and fatally, it influenced Adolf Hitler's calculations.
Hitler watched the Soviets struggle against tiny Finland and concluded that the Red Army was weak. That assumption heavily contributed to his disastrous decision to invade the USSR in 1941. Finland's legacy directly shaped World War II. Moving on to Section 4, the universal principle, going beyond the inventory.
We've seen the data, we've analyzed the terrain, the outcomes, and the legacy. Now, let's zoom out for a second. What do these two distinct wars, fought in completely different extremes of the world, collectively teach us? Well, they teach us this. Power is not only what can be counted on an inventory. It's incredibly tempting to just look at a list of soldiers, artillery shells, tanks, or GDP and declare a winner before the first shot is even fired. But this explainer proves that the reality of asymmetric warfare completely defies standard accounting.
Both Estigarribia and Mannerheim prove that unquantifiable factors absolutely rewrite the battlefield equation. It comes down to an intimate, almost cellular knowledge of your own terrain. It requires an iron willingness by the defending population to sustain a catastrophic human cost. And above all, it relies on the absolute conviction that fighting at home against an enemy who has no idea where they are standing gives you an advantage that literally no factory can produce. These are the elements that bend the great to the will of the small.
And finally, Section 5, Verdict and Final Close, the ultimate judgment.
This brings us to the final, uncompromising judgment of the season. We have rigidly analyzed resource disadvantage, the weaponization of terrain, strategic outcomes, and historical legacies. So, who was the ultimate victor of the asymmetric war? The verdict is an argued draw. And I deliver this not out of diplomacy, but out of strict analytical rigor. Paraguay achieved a more complete strategic and territorial victory. Finland overcame a vastly more impossible material disadvantage and left a much heavier footprint on global history. They are two distinct historical miracles, but they share the exact same essence. Both nations fundamentally mastered the same impossible equation of survival. Now, I invite you to dispute this verdict in your own studies, but you must do so with concrete evidence, not just preference.
Throughout this entire season, we have collectively witnessed exactly how Paraguay survived its brutal history, utilizing brilliant strategy, lethal terrain, and sheer will to defend its very existence against all odds. But now that we understand exactly how this nation secured its borders and survived, what will its vibrant cultural history reveal to us next season? Thank you so much for joining me for Season 2 of our Explainer. I'll see you next time.